Welcome, everyone. This is the webinar, The Supply and Demand for Rural Teachers. My name is Julie Squire. I am an associate partner at Bellwether Education Partners, and I help manage ROCKY, the Rural Opportunity Consortium of Idaho. The initiative, for those of you who don't know, is sponsored by the J.A. and Catherine Albertson Foundation of Boise, and it brings together some of the nation's best thinkers in education to conduct research on the challenges of rural education. Today, we have Daniel Player with us to discuss his research on teachers in rural America. The full report will be available next week, along with other ROCKY publications on our website, which is www.rockyidaho.org. That's www.rockyidaho.org. By way of brief introduction, Dan is a research assistant professor at the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia. He was formerly a senior researcher at Mathematica as well. He's an economist and focuses on the education workforce, particularly links among policy, funding, performance incentives, and the quality of teachers and principals. He has also studied the economics of rural areas and farmers' adoption of new methods. I'm now going to hand this over to Dan, who will give about a 40-minute presentation. After that, we'll answer questions from the audience. If you have any questions during or after the presentation, feel free, please, to type it into the question chat box in the WebEx platform, and we'll do our best to answer them all. So with that, Dan, why don't you take it away?
All right, thanks very much, Julie. Can you hear me okay? Hopefully so. Well, I appreciate that introduction. Yes. I'm excited to kind of present some of the things that I've been working on and thinking a lot about over the last year, and I hope that it's relevant and timely for the audience members. And if at any time, just to reiterate what Julie said, if there's a question, a clarifying question or whatever, please feel free to post that in the chat box, and I'll try to address your interests as much as I can. So the webinar aims, as I view it, I'm going to provide a brief overview of sort of the general public teacher labor market, a primer on some of the facts about what we know about the teacher labor market, and then illustrate the trends over time for rural and non-rural schools, and provide some context in particular for Idaho's teacher labor market, and then offer some recommendations that I think arise from the analysis. But this preliminary analysis was primarily one that was descriptive and just sort of understanding the lay of the land. So let me just jump into how this came about. So the teacher trends are what we've seen in the literature is that when there have long been concerns about teacher shortages, and this was exacerbated when No Child Left Behind came and required that a highly effective teacher in every classroom, and then the baby boomer retirement has heightened some concerns of a looming teacher shortage. But what we've seen play out is that so far a nationwide shortage of teachers has not materialized, and in fact, one researcher went so far as to say that it is a myth that there is a dearth of qualified teachers. So those are some pretty strong words, and I recognize that your mileage may vary. It may be a different situation in districts and schools that you are working in. And so I think that a more productive way to think about shortages and teacher shortages is that they are localized. And what I mean by that is shortages are really in particular subjects, and math, science, and special education are the ones that are focused on most often, and in particular schools. So high poverty schools, schools of low parental involvement, and low support from school leadership. So with that kind of as the background, we went into this project not knowing a lot about how rural teacher labor markets compared with the ones that had been studied more frequently. And historically, urban teacher labor markets have been studied in greater depth because of the availability of data, and a lot of policy has been aimed at urban schools. And so we wanted to see, as I jumped into this project, whether some of the same patterns were observed in rural schools that we see in suburban and urban schools. And you can imagine that rural schools, there are some forces sort of working against rural schools. They may be more isolated and have fewer community amenities. There are also schools that tend to be smaller and offer fewer opportunities for specialized teaching. And there's also kind of a sociological a phenomenon where if you're in a smaller community, there's a greater pressure to be the teacher 24/7. You don't sort of have the opportunity to be lost in a larger community like you would in an urban area where on a weekend no one would recognize you as a teacher. However, there are some things, I think amenities going the other direction as well. So there's potentially better connection with parents and community, often a lower cost of living than urban or even suburban areas, and then greater access to outdoor amenities. So while you may not have as many community amenities, you may have greater access to outdoor amenities. And at this point, I should pause and note that I'm not going to go. I intentionally didn't bore you with all the citations, but many of these are taken from other sources of literature that have looked at these things. So if you're interested, I encourage you to read the report. I'm trying to keep this as interesting as possible for all of you participants. So what else do we know about the teacher labor market in general? Well, the first fact, and this is has played out on looking at statewide data in New York, that teachers tend to teach near where they grew up. They also tend to teach in the same type of schools in which they grew up. So looking at a large data set from all of the school teachers in New York State, they found that when they were able to match them to the high school, if you went to a rural high school, you tended to end up teaching in a rural high school. And likewise, teachers who grew up in urban areas and went to urban high schools end up teaching more often in urban schools, and the same is true of suburban. And so we might worry that rural regions, well, we know that rural regions have lower college-going rates than suburban or urban communities, mostly suburban. I think there's some question about the urban communities, but let's focus on suburban. So if rural regions have lower college-going rates than suburban, then therefore it's possible that rural areas may face a smaller pool of potential teaching candidates than non-rural areas. So that's another fact that we need to consider and think about that could influence the potential shortages in rural areas. So with all that as background, and like I said, most of this has been done by other researchers, I wanted to take this study and looking at across about 15 years of data using the Schools and Staffing Survey. And the Schools and Staffing Survey is a nationally representative survey of public districts. I'm going to use the public district schools and teachers. There are also the private wave, but I'm going to focus on the public one in this study. And that works out to about 8,000 schools per wave that are, again, nationally representative. So they use complex sampling to try to make sure that they get a sample of schools that really reflect the nation. And then each one of those waves, so those four waves, also survey about 30,000 teachers. So it's a fairly comprehensive survey, and we have it over a fairly long time horizon. And the survey asks, of course, in the school survey, they ask about school structure, and in the teacher survey, they ask about teacher background, teacher attitudes, practices, et cetera. So I'm going to focus. I wanted to focus on part of this is drawn from the school survey, looking at how they see the supply and the demand for their teachers, and then I also look a little bit about teacher attitudes and teacher practices, and just for data comparability purposes, for the teacher survey, I focused just on that last year. We have enough teachers in 2011 that all the teacher data come from just that last wave of the survey. So one of the challenges that the first comes in this is how do we define what a rural school is? And for this, I punt a little bit and use the National Center of Education Statistics definition of rural. And I put this up here just as a reference so you can keep in mind of how they're defining what a rural school is. So urban schools are those in cities with populations of at least 100,000, and suburban schools are considered to be in urbanized territories outside of urban areas. They also designate towns, which are smaller urban clusters, so it's smaller than 100,000 people that are within 35 miles of an urban area. And then rural is everything essentially that doesn't fit into one of those categories. So it's at least 2.5 miles from an urban cluster, which could mean a suburban area or a town. And they further designate rural into three types of rural schools. So there are rural fringe, which are sort of on the fringe of either a suburban or an urban area, or a town, a large town. And then there are what are called rural distant and rural remote. And rural remote are as you would imagine, the most remote schools that are at least 25 miles from any urban area. So using that definition, I'm going to look at some differences across urban and across rural and then comparison schools. So with that, I'm going to jump right into the data, and I should have mentioned that one of my objectives of the webinar is not to bore you to death with too many figures and numbers, but I hope to show you what I think are the most interesting facts that came out of this descriptive study. So first, I'm just going to look at teacher vacancies and broadly speaking. And to start this off, I just wanted to look at how schools have the number of teachers per school and how that has changed over the waves of the Schools and Staffing Survey. And one of the things that I think was interesting that came out of this is that rural schools, in comparison to others, have gotten slightly larger. So it's on the horizontal axis, of course, is the time, each wave of the SAS, and on the vertical axis is the number of teachers per school. And it's a rough measure, but it helps us to see how schools are getting, the size of schools. And you see that there's this trend in the urban schools, that's the lighter green. They have gotten smaller over this period, while rural schools have gotten somewhat larger. The next breaks it down by those types of rural schools. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to present rural, and then I'm going to put Idaho-specific numbers in there. And Idaho, because the national sample is, again, it's nationally representative, I don't break Idaho out by rural and non-rural areas. I just look at the state averages. But you can see that Idaho maps pretty closely with rural, remote schools in the country. So that those bottom two lines reflect Idaho, and then all of the remote rural schools throughout the United States. And you see that those are quite a bit smaller on average than schools in rural fringe areas. And what you'll see throughout the foreshadowing, I think, the findings is that rural fringe schools tend to look a little bit more like suburban schools than they do like the rural remote schools. And so there are, I think, important differences that come out of this. So with this in mind, I think we see that there haven't been large changes over the wave of this, which of course straddles No Child Left Behind. And so there haven't been a lot of structural changes that we see, and our hope is that as we're pooling data together, we can see some important trends that have persisted over the time of the waves of this survey. So the first question I want to look at is how often schools report a vacancy. And the way that I did this was simply looking at the schools in the Schools and Staffing Survey and whether reported a vacancy in any subject. And then I break down the vacancies by vacancy type, and all of the vacancy types are contingent upon them having a position. So in other words, the elementary school vacancy is whether they have a vacancy only for schools that actually have elementary grades, and et cetera. So we see that there all the bars represent urban, suburban, town, and rural from left to right, and there are no differences in whether they have a vacancy in any subject. And what we see is, moving to the next category, is that if we look at elementary school vacancies, urban and suburban schools have slightly higher vacancy rates in elementary than do rural or town schools. And the stars indicate that those differences are statistically significant. In other words, we can be more confident that those are real differences and not just chance differences. Interesting, as we look at going to the further right, in STEM fields, so that's science, technology, engineering, and math. So the urban and suburban schools are actually less likely to have to report having a vacancy in one of those fields. And further right, all of the schools that we look at, urban, suburban, town, are all more likely to report a vacancy in English language learning for English language learning teachers. Now looking at this by rural categories, so looking at Idaho is the one on the furthest to the left, and then fringe, distant, and remote schools. I think the bottom line here is that there are some patterns that emerge that I think are interesting and will kind of foreshadow some of the main conclusions that we have in the recommendations I make. So in fringe schools, again, that sort of reflect the story that we see more in suburban schools, and that is that they're more likely to report a vacancy in elementary than other places. In Idaho, if for you who are listening and are interested in Idaho, are much more likely to report a vacancy in a STEM field than other rural schools. So they're more so schools across Idaho, on average, are much more likely than other than rural schools to report a vacancy in a STEM field. Well, I think vacancies are one thing, but of course we are also concerned about whether they can fill those vacancies. So that was the next thing that I looked at. I decided to see whether schools reported finding difficulty in hiring for these positions. So these next set of charts are contingent upon them saying that they had a vacancy in a given field. And I'm going to go back to this urban, suburban, town, and rural comparisons. And rural schools, focusing on the first one, whether they had, this is the one on the left, rural schools were about the same as anyone else to report difficulty in filling a vacancy. Now, I think I have to offer the caveat here that principals who are filling out this survey may interpret that question differently depending on where they are, and I think we need to keep that in mind. But they interpret the difficulty approximately the same across the different school types. There is some the town schools are slightly lower than rural schools, but others are roughly the same. One of the big differences we see is that the urban schools are actually more likely to report elementary vacancies, but the bottom line is very few that reported. So if you remember from the previous slides, a lot of them reported having vacancies in elementary school, but very few of those report having difficulty filling those. So if we look at looking at rural schools, fewer than 5% of schools with a vacancy in an elementary teacher reported having difficulty filling that vacancy. The difference there is some difference if we look at STEM fields. Rural schools have greater difficulty filling those than suburban schools do, but they're roughly the same as urban schools. And I think the one that's the most stark is the difficulty filling English language learners. So rural schools have a much more difficult time filling vacancies in ELL. So roughly 40% of schools that reported having a vacancy in ELL said it was difficult to fill that vacancy. Now, I think it's important to remember that there are fewer schools in rural areas that reported vacancies in ELL fields, but of those that had the vacancies, they had a more difficult time filling those. Again, I break this out by Idaho and the fringe and distant and remote. And again, a similar story plays out. The remote schools have the most difficulty filling STEM vacancies, and in general, the remote schools do suggest on the far left that they have a harder time than other places filling vacancies in general. So that's sort of consistent with what we might expect, that rural, remote areas have a difficult time filling vacancies. There are the differences, looking at Idaho specifically, none of the differences were statistically significant. So what that means is that Idaho was no different than remote rural schools on some of these things that we could detect. And although the differences sometimes are large, it has to do with sample size also plays into this. So I think the takeaway is that rural schools have fewer vacancies to fill in a lot of areas. But after accounting for school size, and I didn't show this here, but once I account for the fact that rural schools are smaller, vacancies occur roughly at the same rate across school types, and there isn't a big difference there. There aren't huge differences in expressed difficulty of filling vacancies, but there is some evidence in ELL and STEM fields that rural schools have a more difficult time. So I think the first set of results suggests that that rural schools aren't dramatically different in terms of their vacancies, but we want to start thinking a little bit about whether the teachers that are hired in the schools are comparable, because we might worry that some schools are hiring, they're able to find people who are qualified on paper but may not be as qualified in the classroom. And the challenge with this is, I have to admit up front, that we don't have great data on this, and so we have to use our imaginations to some extent. Prior research has found that teacher experience is an important indicator of teacher quality. Also, states recognize master's degrees as being as reflecting teacher quality, I think, as evidenced by the fact they pay teachers with master's degree more. So that would imply states value master's degrees as a measure of teacher quality. So I decided to look at some of those things and to see whether there were differences in the types of teachers who are teaching in these different schools. So that's the next set of results, the next set of slides that we'll look at. So looking quickly at this, teachers are less likely in rural areas to have graduated from a selective college. Now, rural areas, if you notice, the rural areas are actually slightly ahead of towns in this area, but they're roughly equivalent there. Teachers in rural areas are somewhat less likely to have received alternative certifications, so in other words, to have received a certificate without participating in a traditional undergraduate teaching program. And one of the things that stands out, I think, most strikingly is that the teachers in rural areas are consistently less likely to have a master's degree, and I'll show you in a second that plays out by the degree of how rural the school is. We might be concerned that rural schools have more novice teachers, and on the whole, the differences there are some statistically significant differences, but they're not large differences. So I think that the evidence here is that the rural teachers are no more likely to be novice teachers, and I define that as teachers in their first 3 years of teaching. So again, looking at this by breaking it out by Idaho and the different types of rural. For you in Idaho, you might be interested to see that there's a big difference between the teachers who graduate from selective colleges in Idaho schools versus even other rural schools. Also, teachers in Idaho are much less likely to have received alternative certification and are much less likely also to have a master's degree. There's no difference in whether they're novice teachers or not. So this is some evidence that there are some differences in the types of teachers, and some of this may reflect, particularly if we're looking at Idaho, this may reflect the availability of, for instance, selective colleges and alternative certification programs. So another thing that I wanted to look at was, are teachers, do they have a chance to progress on the job and develop, to receive professional development? So I looked at that also. I was wondering if rural teachers had fewer opportunities. And this is, again, it's difficult to get at whether they had the opportunity, but this is whether they reported participating in professional development in the previous year. And there are some differences in whether they had received professional development in their own subject and computers for instruction, but they're fairly small differences. And I think the takeaway here is that a lot of teachers received professional development in their own subject, and the differences were small between rural and non-rural schools. Teachers were I think one difference that does stand out is rural teachers were much less likely than urban teachers to have received professional development in English language learner strategies. And some of that may be warranted. I think there may be rural areas that have fewer ELL students, and maybe it is not as important as it is in rural and urban areas. But I think it's a thing to keep in mind, to keep an eye on as more rural areas have greater immigrant populations, and to make sure that schools are responding to that. So I think it's one thing to keep in mind for schools and districts. Other differences don't stand out too much. I think it's interesting to note that rural schools were as equally likely with other teachers to report having university-sponsored professional development, roughly at about 25 to 30%. Again, breaking this out by Idaho versus other types of rural schools, there's a huge difference in Idaho, and this could be a program-specific or a state-specific program. But Idaho, the thing that stands out is the far right. They have much more university-sponsored professional development than other rural areas. And Idaho teachers also were more likely to participate in professional development for ELL strategies. One other, I think, difference for Idaho schools that stands out, I apologize for going sort of backwards order here, but the Idaho teachers were also less likely to report receiving professional development in using computers for instruction than other rural teachers. So I think the takeaway here is that there are some differences in the types of teachers teaching in rural and urban and suburban areas. And it's quite pronounced in some ways in Idaho, particularly with the master's degrees and their likelihood of graduating from a selective college. I think we should feel good about there's not being a lot of difference in the percentage of teachers who are in their first 3 years, which again, research has shown that teachers in their first 3 years are less effective than teachers with more experience, and there doesn't seem to be a systematic difference in the number of those teachers in rural and non-rural areas. And there's also some evidence that teachers in rural areas are getting professional development at approximately the same rate as teachers in other areas. And whether that's the right amount or not, I don't know, but it's the same as other places, roughly. Although there, in some areas, I was, for instance, beforehand was thinking that school teachers in rural areas would have less university-sponsored professional development because they're typically further from university, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Well, I think the last thing that I wanted to look at then was having taken all this into account. So we see that teachers are different. We see that there aren't huge differences in the vacancies in rural and non-rural schools. But let's look at how the teachers feel. So the last area was just teacher satisfaction, contrasting various measures that are correlated with teacher satisfaction. So one of those, the areas that people have found correlates with teacher satisfaction is the amount of influence they feel in classroom decisions. And so I took 3 of these. These are questions about how much the influence the teachers feel that they have in classroom, including choosing classroom texts, and classroom content and teaching techniques. And they answered this on a 1 to 4 scale, and I included everyone who said a 3 or a 4, meaning they had a lot of influence. I summed those up, and so on the far left, starting with classroom texts, teachers in town and rural areas report having about 60% of those teachers report having a great deal of influence in the decision over which texts to use in their class. They also report having greater autonomy on classroom content. And the teaching techniques, almost all of the teachers report having a high level of influence in their teaching techniques, but there are some slight statistically significant differences between rural and suburban and urban teachers. Looking at this again for Idaho, all of Idaho schools. Than the fringe, distant, and remote. The Idaho is not statistically different from other remote rural schools, but there is this pattern that seems to suggest that the more rural you are, the more remote rural you are, the more influence you report having over both your text and your content. And then the teaching techniques, again, many report having a lot of influence there. Well, they also asked in this survey, they asked just directly whether the level of job satisfaction. And they asked it in a few different ways. One is, how much do you agree with these statements that they think about transferring? And urban teachers think about transferring more often than others, but it could also be that they have more opportunity to transfer than others. Although urban and suburban, I think there are interesting differences there. They ask whether they think the school is well run or not, and this is again people who agree with this statement that the school is well run. Rural teachers report this more often than other teachers, and I think the differences between urban and town schools are meaningful in that rural teachers feel like their schools are well run more often. It's a small difference, but it is statistically significant. And then going the next one to the right, whether they're satisfied with their salary. I'm sort of surprised that anyone said yes, but apparently 10% or between 10 and 15% reported being satisfied with their salary, and rural places where suburban really stands out there as where teachers are slightly more satisfied, but urban and rural are similar in that area. And then the next two questions I think are interesting because they ask, and I think if I had to do this over again, I'd reverse the order. So they ask whether the teacher was generally satisfied, and then they ask, well, are other teachers at your school satisfied? And systematically, people think that they are more satisfied. The people who are answering the survey think they're more satisfied than other people at this school, but the patterns are identical. They're just sort of shrunken. And you see again that the rural schools are more likely to report being satisfied as being a teacher at that school and feeling like others' teachers are satisfied at that school. Then they ask whether the teachers would leave as soon as possible if there was a better paying job that came along. And again, few teachers report that they would, and rural teachers are slightly more likely than non-rural teachers, at least suburban and town teachers, to say that they would leave for a higher paying job. Well, looking at Idaho and the different types of rural schools, I think one of the things that stands out is that third one over, I am satisfied with my salary. That is so small I couldn't fit the star on it. So it's, Idaho teachers are much less likely than even the small number of other rural teachers to report being satisfied with their salary. Idaho teachers, I think, also somewhat troublesome is the fact that they report being satisfied at lower rates than other teachers compared to rural schools. And Idaho teachers, again, are less likely to feel like others at their school are satisfied. And there's no statistically significant difference in whether they would leave for a higher paying job, but it's trending toward looking like Idaho teachers are more likely to say they'd leave for a higher paying job. And I thought, just for reference, I would put the total school earnings. So they asked the teachers to report the total amount they earn from all school-related activities. So that includes their salary as well as any pay they get for coaching or extracurricular duties. And you see where Idaho fits in there, lower than rural fringe, rural distant, or rural remote. And, of course, the rural schools tend to be below the suburban and urban schools. So that may give some background, I think, on why Idaho teachers are less likely to say they're satisfied with their salary. Probably not news to some people on the phone. So I think the takeaway here is that rural areas offer some more autonomy and flexibility than non-rural areas. And I think an important takeaway here is that teachers in rural areas report being just as satisfied and often more satisfied than their non-rural counterparts. I think the biggest concern comes up with salary. And then I think Idaho also, I think we have to be mindful that Idaho, for some reason, the teachers in Idaho report lower satisfaction, both with their salary and their general satisfaction with their schools, which I think is some cause for concern, or at least further study. So I think the takeaways here that I would say, big picture, taking all of this together, is that there isn't much evidence that that rural areas have greater difficulty filling vacancies than non-rural schools. And it sort of mirrors, I think, what we talked about in the national trends. I think the more productive discussion is talking about localized areas that are difficult to fill and localized subjects that are difficult to fill. There is some evidence that teachers in rural areas are different on observable characteristics than teachers in non-rural areas, and whether we should be concerned about that or not, I think is up for some debate. I hinted that there's some evidence that teachers with less experience are tend to be less effective in the classroom. But those other things that I pointed out, the master's degree and whether they've graduated from a selective college, the evidence is much weaker on those. And so whether we should be concerned or not is, I think, a question that we'll have to continue to look at. I think on the positive side, I think teachers in rural areas report greater control and autonomy, and that and appear to be pretty satisfied with their jobs relative to other teachers, or so at least they're not more dissatisfied than others. So I think the recommendation that I would make, and then I'll open up to questions and comments, is that I think our more productive policy is to focus on recruiting and retaining teacher quality in targeted ways, targeted areas, and rather than just generally trying to recruit more teachers. We saw that there's almost very, very few schools report difficulty in hiring elementary school teachers, and so maybe it doesn't make as much sense to focus on a general recruiting effort as much as a targeted recruiting effort at the particular areas, ELL and STEM fields that rural areas seem to struggle with. I think that there's also an opportunity to examine the role of salaries and other financial incentives in recruiting teachers. And I recognize that a lot of this is subject to state regulations and policies. I did look at the district was asked what sorts of strategies they use to try to recruit teachers. And I didn't show it in this presentation, but school districts in rural areas were much less likely to use kind of non-traditional recruiting techniques than districts in non-rural areas. So districts in rural areas, for instance, were less likely to report using any sort of financial incentives or other recruiting techniques to try to get teachers. And so I think there's a potential there for rural areas to potentially, if it's a issue of constraints, of resource constraints, then to get together a consortium of rural districts to try to be innovative about the ways that they use financial incentives or other recruiting strategies to get teachers into their school districts. And I think that the takeaway here is that rural schools should be playing up that the teachers are happier in rural areas than they are in other places, and as initiatives like Teach for America or other organizations come in and try to bolster the teacher supply in Idaho and other places to really emphasize that it's a nice place to live and it's a nice job to have. So those are the recommendations that I would make and I feel like this was a good introduction to helping us to see where to focus our efforts on rural teachers and how they compare to other places. So I'd love to get your thoughts and comments, and I'll just open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Dan. This is Julie again. We do have a couple of questions for you to respond to. One is a question about whether the survey data that you looked at shows anything about whether teachers are using technology in their classrooms, and if so, if there's any information on whether they are trained to use that technology.
I don't know that off the top of my head whether they talk about technology use. There aren't a lot of questions about their teaching practices But I should look at that and see. We did talk about I did show the amount of professional development they got for computers was less in rural areas, but I should look and see whether they ask about teaching with technology. That's a great suggestion.
And then another question, given what you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation around how teachers are likely to work close to home, close to where they grew up and in schools similar to those they attended, what do you think are the implications for potential grow your own or alternative route teacher preparation programs?
Yeah, I think that's a natural recommendation that comes out of that literature is that whether it's grow your own within your school or even just targeting rural schools to try to get rural teachers, and maybe they won't come back exactly to the same school district, but to be they're used to those environments and they know the benefits of living in a rural area. So I think that does speak to the power of those types of programs. I think we're still. I don't know of large literature that's looked at how successful they've been in retaining teachers, but I think it does speak to that rural communities need to be thinking about how to grow their own teachers, and whether that's starting with high schoolers or it's exploring alternative certification for teachers who may be already living in the community for one reason or another. One of the many rural areas are destination for retirement retirees who really value the slower pace, and they value the outdoor amenities and things. And I think that's a potentially untapped talent pool of people who maybe were not teachers as part of their career, but have a lot of background and might be willing to teach. And I think rural schools should be, and all schools really could be innovative in thinking about how they hire teachers. So maybe it's not a full-time position, but it's maybe someone to come in for an hour a day to teach a computer class or something. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of potential for using who you have in your communities for those types of programs.
And you touched briefly on this at the end around incentives to recruit teachers to rural areas. Do you know of other states that have tried to do this, and do you know if it's proven to be effective?
I don't know. For rural, there's been such a lack of focus, unfortunately, on rural schools. So I don't know of places that have done it specifically for rural areas. I can speak to urban areas where they've tried similar things. So I think there are a lot of parallels with with urban schools and rural schools in recruiting teachers to be there. And rural schools, exercises that have been done in urban schools have found that financial incentives, that teachers respond to financial incentives. Unfortunately, with rural schools, with urban schools, the challenge they face is that they may get a teacher in the door if you get a signing bonus, for instance, and if you give them a signing bonus, that they have to stay for 5 years. And what they'll find is that in an urban area they'll leave after 5 years. But the difference that's I think important between rural and urban areas on that is that an urban area, it's much easier to leave and find other schools to go teach at after their 5 years are up. But I think a rural area potentially has the opportunity to really get a teacher to have put down roots after 5 years and not want to leave the area. So so the bottom line is that no one, to my knowledge, has looked at this type of a program in a rural school, but I would be really interested to see someone do it.
Great. And does the data show that teachers in rural areas are likely to stay in their positions longer than teachers in urban areas? Is there reduced mobility?
Yeah, there is other rural research that I've looked at. There is less mobility. There's less mobility, as you might expect, across schools, and part of that is there are probably fewer opportunities, like I said, to go to a different school. And as far as teacher attrition from leaving the profession, off the top of my head, I don't know, but it would be really interesting to look at for rural versus non-rural. That's another. I'll jot it down as my next thing to look at.
Great. And then just, I think, two more questions we have here, and any of the attendees who'd like to ask us another question, just to remind you, there's a chat box in the WebEx platform labeled Q&A. If you're not in full screen mode, it's at the top right-hand side of your screen, a little blue box. If you are in full screen mode and you scroll all the way up to the top of the screen, a little menu bar will appear, and you can enter into this question into the chat box that way. You mentioned, Dan, the increased influence that rural teachers report having in school-based decision-making. Mm-hmm. Is there any data, or do you have a sense even of whether that influence is through informal channels, or whether the schools are creating formal committees or formal structures to encourage that?
Yeah, I wish I knew that. I was wondering the same thing as I did. We don't have great data on that, so I don't know whether it's structural or just informal. One of the things that's interesting is it continues to persist even if you account for school size. So, for instance, you can imagine that a smaller school you just have more influence because you're one voice of 15 versus one voice of 50. But even if you control for school size, you could look at a school, for instance, of 20 in a rural area and a school of 20 in a suburban area, and teachers in the rural area report having greater autonomy, even contingent on their controlling for their school size. So I don't know what it is, but it isn't just the school size that's driving it, and it could be. It could be something about the community, again, around rural areas. It's just a different community when you're living in a small place and you are running into these people at the grocery store and you're going to church with them and you're seeing them a lot.
And then the last question I have is actually my own question, and maybe not to put you too much on the spot, Dan, but I was wondering, you're finishing up this first paper and diving into a second paper, and I was wondering if you could just give our attendees a sense of the topic that you're looking at next.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it's a bit of a departure from this one, but I think it's connected, and that is I'm looking in this second year. So it's tied in terms of the higher education. I wanted to look at kind of the student side of this story and there's this evidence of a gap in college attending rates between rural and non-rural students, and I think that has implications for the teacher workforce later on, but it also has implications for the economy more broadly. And so I'm trying to tease out now, using a different national longitudinal survey, looking at students from 10th grade. It follows them from 10th grade all the way to I think it's 8 years after they've graduated from high school, and trying to kind of tease out where we're losing rural students. So just kind of preliminarily, the students in 10th grade in rural areas are not too different than students in non-rural areas in reporting how many of them want to go to college and get a 4-year college degree. But then, so as of 10th grade, they look very similar, but then there's this drop-off. Part of it happens in 12th grade. When they interview them again in 12th grade, fewer students in rural areas. There's a bigger drop-off in rural areas. So we're trying to tease out what exactly is going on. That's whether it's a constraint that they're facing in a life constraint or what it is that's keeping them from going on and getting a college degree.
Great.
So that's a teaser.
And that research will be coming out probably, guessing right now based on our schedule, sometime this late spring or summer. So everybody keep your eyes peeled, and we'll be sure to reach out to you with that as it becomes available. I think that concludes all of the questions that we've gotten from the audience. Dan, thank you so much for doing this presentation. I hope everybody got something valuable out of it and it informed their work in Idaho or beyond Idaho. We'll be in touch about future Rocky events shortly.
All right. I actually have a quick question for you, Julie.
Sure.
I got a question of whether the slides would be made available, and I didn't know the answer to that.
Oh, yes, of course. That's a great question. So, yes, the slides will be made available, as will a recording of the webinar. We'll be posting it on the Rocky website, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email with that information after the webinar concludes.
All right, thanks.
Great, thank you.